Join us as we dive deep into the Constitution to figure out what states' rights really mean, and see if we can make sense of it all in just 5 minutes. The United States was born from a rebellion against centralized authority. The original 13 colonies, wary of replicating the strong central government they had just fought to overthrow, were determined to retain a significant degree of autonomy. This desire for self-governance laid the groundwork for the concept of states' rights. States' rights refer to the powers and authorities that the U.S. Constitution reserves for the states, as opposed to those granted to the federal government. This principle recognizes the states as sovereign entities with their own spheres of influence. The balance of power between the federal government and the states has been a source of debate and conflict throughout American history. From the very beginning, the issue of states' rights was intertwined with the institution of slavery. Southern states, heavily reliant on enslaved labor, feared federal interference with their peculiar institution. This tension over slavery would continue to escalate, ultimately leading to the cataclysmic Civil War. The U.S. Constitution, while establishing a more unified nation, aimed to strike a balance between national and state power. The 10th Amendment, often cited as the cornerstone of states' rights, states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." This seemingly straightforward amendment has been subject to a wide range of interpretations. Proponents of strong states' rights argue that the 10th Amendment limits the federal government's authority to those powers explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. Any powers not specifically granted to the federal government, they contend, are reserved for the states. However, others argue that the 10th Amendment merely clarifies rather than limits federal power. They point to the Constitution's necessary and proper clause, which grants Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. This clause, they argue, provides the federal government with a degree of flexibility in addressing national issues. The Civil War stands as the most tragic example of the conflict between states' rights and federal authority. Southern states, invoking the doctrine of states' rights, seceded from the Union in 1860 to 1861 over the issue of slavery. They argued that the federal government had overstepped its bounds by attempting to restrict slavery in newly admitted territories. The Civil War's outcome reaffirmed the supremacy of the federal government, but the debate over states' rights did not end there. Nearly a century later, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s reignited the debate. Southern states, once again citing states' rights, resisted federal efforts to desegregate schools and public accommodations. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, landmark pieces of federal legislation, ultimately prevailed, dismantling Jim Crow laws and securing equal rights for African Americans. These triumphs demonstrated the federal government's power to protect individual rights, even when challenged on states' rights grounds. The debate over states' rights remains relevant in the 21st century, albeit in different forms. From healthcare and education to environmental regulations and gun control, the balance of power between the federal government and the states continues to be a source of contention. Today, debates often center on the role of the federal government in addressing issues that transcend state borders. For instance, should the federal government set national standards for healthcare coverage, or should states have the autonomy to determine their own policies? Should the federal government regulate greenhouse gas emissions to combat climate change, or should states have the flexibility to pursue their own environmental strategies? These questions highlight the complex interplay between national interests and states' rights in modern America. As the nation grapples with evolving challenges, the enduring tension between federal power and state autonomy will continue to shape the American political landscape.